There we go. Should be. Is that working? Yeah. There we go. Okay, great. Hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Yes, Caroline. I finally chopped my hair off. That's the lockdown thing. What I need to do now is to bake some banana bread and roll TikTok. So, thanks everyone for tuning in tonight for Assembly Online. Hope you're all well and surviving lockdown. It's been 2 weeks since we last did a broadcast. The international poetry reading that was 2 weeks ago is now available on the website. Thanks to everyone who spoke to that. It was a really successful event, and thanks to Clyde Draper for hosting. If you haven't tuned in before, the Assembly Online programme is a series of free events that bringing events to you at home during isolation. And if you're not on the mailing list and would like to be, I'll post a link into the YouTube chat now that you can join. Tonight's event is Of and By, which is a series of talks, screenings and discussions organised by the contemporary art critic Jonathan P. Watts. Tonight's event is with Louis Henderson, who was born in Norwich but moved out of here 17 years ago, 2003, and now lives between Paris and Berlin. I'll let Jonathan do the proper introduction, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more chat and to talk about the event that's coming up in 2 weeks. But for now, hopefully, I'll smoothly transition to Jonathan.
1, 2, 2, 1. Very smooth transition there. Thank you, Henry.
Hang on, Jonathan. Need to change the window. Where's it? There we go. That's coming through.
One, two, 2, 1. Thanks, Henry. Okay, so presumably you can hear me. I'm just talking into an LCD display. My name's Jonathan, as Henry has already said. I'm an art writer and an occasional curator based in Norwich. I'm also the programmer of and By, which, as Henry said, is an ongoing series of artists' talks, screenings, and conversations hosted by the Assembly House Trust in Norwich. Of and By is part of the wider programme of contemporary art and activity that's overseen by the Trust's visual arts coordinator, Henry, who you've just met in a weird sort of way over distance. The programme Of and By, it doesn't really have a thematic design as such. It's not tightly programmed to develop a set of themes, but what coheres the programme, however loosely, is that the work presented has some association with East Anglia. So several weeks ago, we welcomed the artist filmmaker Emily Richardson on this online platform, who showed Houseworks, which is a trilogy of films on single-storey flat roof modernist dwellings in Suffolk. And before that, in what really kind of seems like a different world, Simeon Barclay got on the train and came down to Norwich from Yorkshire to join us in person at the Assembly House. So as a result of the pandemic, Of and By has moved online. And what this move to an online platform means is that this tie to East Anglia is perhaps loosened further. What is lost in this possibility of gathering, of assembling in a place, is gained in access. And this is the first screening of Louis Henderson's film, Evidence of Things Unseen But Heard, in the UK. But it's interesting to think about what this territorial boundedness really means in this context of the online platform. Lou Henderson, who I'm really delighted to be hosting this evening, as Henry has already said, was born in Norwich, but he's lived in Barcelona, Paris, Haiti, and now Berlin. And although I'd known of Louis in his earlier days as a skateboarder, as I'm sure some of you did too, I was properly reintroduced in London to Louis in 2011 by the filmmaker William Rayburn, who shared my invitation to screen his work Thames film with Louis, who showed his recently finished film A Walk with Nigel. And in this dual screen video essay, Louis revisits the same locations that his uncle, yes, the same Henderson, Nigel Henderson of the Independent Group, photographed in East London in the late 1950s. In this earliest film, certain preoccupations are already present. So this idea of archaeology as a method, a kind of love of archives, a materialistic attention to social relations, a kind of fascination with history, an obsession with the technique of collage. And really, the essay film is a kind of ideal discursive medium. And I don't think form is quite the right word, because the essay really has no rules as such. But really, the essay film is the ideal discursive medium to explore what would become a further set of preoccupations of Louis in his work: revolts, riots, uprisings, and specifically within colonial struggles. Those colonial struggles are not struggles that take place over there. And as this film that we're showing tonight demonstrates in a really vivid way, colonial struggles are all around us in history, but also in the afterlives of those histories in our present times. This film that we're going to show this evening of Louis really calls into question our current global condition, defined by this idea of racial capitalism, which is an idea that we'll talk about hopefully in the conversation, and also these ever-present histories of the European colonial project. Louis is a collaborator. In 2007, Louis worked with Philippe César to produce Op Film, an archaeology of optics, which was at Gasworks Gallery in London. And that same year, he began working with the Living and the Dead Ensemble, a group of artists, performers, and poets from Haiti, France, and the United Kingdom, who came together to produce the Haitian Creole translation and performance of the play Monsieur Toussaint by the French Martinique poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant. Toussaint Louverture is perhaps one of the best known leaders of the Haitian Revolution. Evidence of Things Unseen But Heard, which was produced in 2018, which will be screening tonight, was commissioned by Natasha Ginwala and IFA Gallery in Berlin for the exhibition titled Riots, Slow Cancellation of the Future. Henderson's film is the first chapter in a series of audiovisual collages conducted as what he calls an archaeological survey into the music scene of the city of Bristol, specifically plotting what's known as the Bristol Sound. So in the beginning is the neighbourhood of St. Paul's in Bristol, but then through collage, it becomes the sugar plantations of the Caribbean that led to the wealth of Bristol as a city through decades of slave trade. But it also might be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And the Atlantic Ocean operates as this connecting space, this connecting volume between these geographies and times, between Bristol and the Caribbean along these routes. The predominantly Caribbean community of St. Paul's protested in April 1980 against police brutality. Protesting in particular against the racist institutions and conditions, structural institutions and conditions of economic oppression of Thatcher's government more broadly. A written essay on this film by Louis, titled the same as the film, will appear in the book Knights of the Dispossessed, Riots Unbound, which is edited by Natasha Ginwala, along with Gal Kern and Nilofer Tajeri, which will be published by the Columbia Press in October this year. Before we run the film, I just would like to thank the Assembly House Trust for hosting us tonight. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Louis for agreeing to screen this film, and also for hanging around and joining me afterwards for a conversation about the film. It will last the duration of approximately 20 minutes. And then Louis and I will talk for around 20 minutes or so. But also, as you probably have noticed, on the YouTube page, there is a stream chat that's going on at the same time as the screening. So in the conversation afterwards, if at any point you want to ask a question, just type it into the stream chat and I will pose it to Louis. So we'd just like to say thank you for joining us too on this wonderful Thursday evening in lockdown. Okay, take it away. Louis, do you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Great. Thank you so much for allowing us to show your film this evening.
Yeah.
Evidence of Things Unseen But Heard. I suppose, well, there's so much to talk about. But I suppose just to start at the very beginning, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the context in which the film was commissioned, because I understand it was commissioned by Natasha Ginwala, the curator, and IFA Gallery for this exhibition. But could you just tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it was an invitation, yeah, like you said, from Natasha. Natasha was interested in doing an exhibition as an artistic survey of kind of the history, well, not the history, but various histories of riots and social uprisings and the sort of ramifications that they had, you know, globally and within a history related to colonial struggles or I mean, anti-colonial upheavals. And she invited me. I mean, actually, it was actually Natasha that co-commissioned the work that you mentioned earlier, Sunstone, that I made with Felipe Cesar for Gasworks and also for the Contour Biennial. So Natasha and I had already been engaged in a conversation to do with these kind of questions, also because she'd wrote a small piece of text about a film that I made in 2015 called Black Code, Code Noir, that spoke about also again about riots and uprisings in the United States in connection also with the history of transatlantic slavery and the history of revolution in Haiti and in France. So anyway, so Natasha knew that I had been working and researching on these kind of topics for some time, and she invited me to make a film in response to that. And also at that moment then for me, I mean, well, no, for many years I've been engaged in research around the film Hands with Songs by the Black Audio Film Collective from 1986. And, you know, Hands with Songs is a film that was made in the 1980s about the riots in Handsworth, but also in London. And in some respects, then that film's timeline begins in 1981 with the first riots in Brixton and the first riots in Handsworth, and then moves through to 1985. And then I was interested to think of how actually, when researching into that era, the 1980s, people had kind of expected that these uprisings might take place in somewhere like Handsworth or Brixton or Toxteth, for example, in Liverpool. but no one had really been expecting it to take place in somewhere like Bristol. And that actually Bristol had had this initial uprising in 1980. Of course, there's been previous uprisings, but these are the uprisings that took place, predominantly within, mixed communities, but communities of people, who had come to England, or they're the second generation children, let's say, of people that had immigrated to England for work. And that this is also in the period of Margaret Thatcher's government. And so I was interested to try and make a film or a video essay that looked into that same period from a similar approach as Black Audio Film Collective followed with Hands with Songs, but as in almost making like not a sequel, but almost a prequel, in the sense that it was looking into the events that had happened somewhat before. And, when I went to the archives in Bristol for the first time and read these newspaper articles, and there's that quote, which is from a newspaper article, which is in the end of the film, reading it in 2017 or 18, it felt like this sort of weird time capsule, because the person said in the newspaper article, if this happened in Bristol, what might happen in other places like Handsworth and Brixton? And from my position in 2018, I could see that newspaper article was a kind of premonition of what was about to happen. But reading it in 2018, it was reading, it's actually it's a strange tense to put yourself in, because in the article it's what's going to happen, but in my instance of reading it, it's happened. So it's a kind of projective past tense. And anyway, me with my interest in archaeology, that little fragment sort of fascinated me.
Can I just ask you, when you talk about an archaeology of film or an archaeological approach to film, can you just tell us a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of divides up into various different ways of understanding how to approach making films. And each of those different ways it branches off actually gets sort of tied together in pretty much all of my works. So on the one hand, there's this kind of particular fascination with material culture, with returning somewhat, well, not returning, that's the wrong word, but to going initially to look at material remains of things that have happened and as they exist in archives. That's one branch of it. So how you initiate the research for a film from starting within like I said, the material remains of some event as they exist in the present, kept within a institutional collection. For example, with my earliest films, it was like with the Tate archives, and then later with an archive at London College of Communication when I made the film Logical Revolts. But also archaeological, another branch of it for me is an interest in, for example, looking at landscape and thinking about history. Again, it's a materialist conception of history, as history might be somewhat buried within the layers of a landscape. But also, so for example, looking, I mean, that particular approach comes from, for example, the work of these French filmmakers, Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Houillet. And their films look very much at what have been argued as sort of empty landscapes. So landscapes devoid of, human presence, but then through the narrative that they unfold in the films, the viewer of the film starts to understand that in fact that landscape is densely populated with human presence, but as they exist in a type of haunting, in the way that those in their films, and I guess something I borrowed from my own work, of looking at landscapes whereby in which important historical events have happened, and if we can think about them and talk about them in the present, that historical event somewhat continues to exist buried underneath that landscape. So for me, I think cinema is a sort of perfect medium for doing precisely that thing. of, on the one hand, kind of inventing stories from archives and from collections of existing material, and then taking those stories to landscapes to think about how they might actually populate landscape. And that's what yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, just that's something I sort of used a lot, which is what I call archival typography. So it's like, how do you spatialize? Like, how do you find the landscape, the archival material? And when I say landscape, I mean that liberally. I mean also urban cityscapes, and I also used to do quite a lot of work on the internet, thinking of the internet as a kind of landscape in which we could look for the material remains of historic events.
You use this lovely expression, critical fabulation, but you've talked about the use of archives, the essay, film, and research as these kind of complementary things. When you were thinking about Bristol, were there particular archives that you had in mind? Was it kind of clear to you in advance where you would go to look for this material? And I guess also that's a question about research, about kind of the extent to which research is important in your practice as a filmmaker.
That bird's going crazy.
Can you hear that? Shall I shut the window? It's the
yeah.
resident jays in the back garden. Let me just close the window.
It's quite nice to have them. Hey, that's better.
It amplified, is that? Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah, no, that. I mean, so let me think how to figure this one out. I mean, it really depends on each project you're working on, right? And exactly, it's a question of research, and it's a question of method and how you think about approaching research for a film. And because obviously we can do this any way around that we can really imagine. I just have my particular fascinations and obsessions. Generally, the films I have done before begin with an archival document that I have somehow stumbled across, and that starts to generate the process of fabulation, the process of fictionalization. So with the film I just finished, the feature film called Ouverture, it began with the letters of Toussaint Louverture that I was reading in the archives in Saint-Denis in Paris. But with this film, the Bristol Project, it actually began initially from a DJ set that I was preparing for a friend's bar in Lisbon called Damas. And I was going to do a night there called Bristol. And I was going to only play records produced in Bristol. And this came from a kind of conversation with some friends about the era of music that we all grew up in and how much interest and love there was for trip hop and music coming from Bristol that was shared from Lisbon to London. So that's how this fascination with Bristol came. Then I was thinking about the Bristol Sound, about the music that came out of Bristol, and then obviously still always rewatching Hands with Songs by the Black Audio Film Collective, and trying to think about how I could piece together actually from that DJ set an essay. And then Natasha came to me with the idea of doing a film for the exhibition on riots. And then I thought, well, actually, it would be very interesting to try and think about the relationship between the development of music, sound system culture in Bristol in response to the riots. Because it's something I'd read. A friend of mine from London had given me a book. Kojo Eshin gave me a book somewhere. I've got it here. I can't remember the title. It's called Rockers something. I've completely forgotten the title, but it's a book written about the record and reggae scene in Bristol in the 1980s. And I think in
Original
that book,
Rockers, is that Richard King?
Original Rockers, Richard King. Thank you. And in the book, he talks about, I think he makes that claim that actually, no, he does, that from the St. Paul's uprising, there was a sort of quite a significant shift and change in the ways in which the community was policed, which meant that then people could actually, spend more time doing street parties and sound system parties. So,
Right.
and that helped flourish this music scene, which eventuated lots of the music that we, you know, that have become like some of the most classic British music acts, you know, in history. So all these things were kind of mixing around. And then I went to the archives in Bristol, but I didn't know really where to go. So I just went to the, you know, the Bristol City Archives. And then it was in the City Archives again that I had this sort of incredible find, something I quite simply just stumbled across, which was, again, this interests me. It's like trying to find the things in archives that might be somewhat ignored, or perhaps not, they go some kind of like maybe unnoticed sometimes. And I just found this envelope full of some printed contact sheets from a series of negatives, and going through the negatives from the start to the finish, about 8 pages of negatives, I saw that it kind of plotted that history. So it begins with police surveillance in the St Paul's neighbourhood in Bristol, photographs of police in cars, and photographs of Caribbean youth on corners. It came from the Bristol Daily, from a newspaper in Bristol. So it's obviously the contact sheets of pictures they were running for their different articles at the time. Then you had pictures from from the St Paul's uprising, of smashed windows, of burnt police cars. Then you had this long series of photographs of just people enjoying a carnival and enjoying sound system parties in the street. So it was from finding that particular archive document, which you see animated in the film, that I then started to, you know, make more sense of what I could sort of piece together in terms of this this audiovisual collage. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess the structural film tradition is to edit from images, not edit to sound. But you're talking about this process of the DJ set as being sound first, you know, the technique of DJing as a form of collage. You know, so sound before images, and it's certainly like that in the Handsworth Songs film. There's a sense in which sound comes first, and that the figure of the DJ, the selector who mixes and melds, precedes. But that's really fascinating, right? Because as a filmmaker, you know, presumably you're concerned with film as a visual medium, but here sound comes before image. And what's interesting to me also is that your subject, or one of your many subjects, dub music, the echo, seems to lend itself to a kind of set of techniques for filmmaking. Could you say something more about that, please?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, no, this is something that interests me enormously. And, you know, for the last sort of few years, I've been thinking about this with a friend of mine. I mentioned him already, Kojo Eshin, who's a writer and teacher and filmmaker, part of the artist duo, the Otolith Group, along with Angelica Saga. We actually just recently did a workshop about this online, thinking of the film Handsworth Songs as what actually I think it was. Yeah, I think it's Uncle. I think it was Uncle Emazor who said it first, but maybe it might have even been Greg Tate that said it originally. But that Handsworth Songs was a type of dub cinema. Right. So it's trying to think about how we could use, I suppose, the sampling and mixing techniques that come out of dub as a process. So, you know, dub obviously is thought of as a genre of reggae music. But actually, dub really is a process. If you know about reggae and what dub is, you understand it as the process through which a studio engineer remixes and manipulates a pre-existing piece of material through the technological innovation of a mixing desk and adding in special effects like echo and delay and all this kind of spatio-temporal bending and stretching that dub does. And And dub really, as a process or as a method, is something that somewhat, kind of predates sampling in a way. So with the film Hands with Songs anyway, both Kojo and I are very interested in trying to kind of pick that to pieces a little bit and try and think about, what does it mean to call a piece of cinema dub cinema? What does it mean to dub cinema? What does it mean to dub with cinema? What does it mean to approach cinema from a position that treats the sonic as a sort of paramount, as the sort of primary, way into thinking about a subject and a topic? And actually, for me, I'll just say one other thing. I mean, I've got so much to say about dub and technique, but I'll just say one other thing quickly about what that means as a filmmaker specifically. And actually, I write this in the essay that's going to be released that you mentioned earlier in October, in the book called Riots Unbound. No, is it called that? I'm so bad with names tonight. There's this line actually from the African-American poet and writer called Fred Moten. And he talks about how sound can bring back or give us back the visuality that oculocentrism has repressed. I find that such a fascinating and complicated phrase. And it can be understood in many different ways. And he uses it to talk about photographs, for example, and what it means to be looking at photographs, and how if we're looking at photographs and we're restricting our understanding of that photograph through one sense, which is sight, that's this way in which oculocentrism, so this obsession with sight as our sort of most important and primary sense, that it ignores the fact that actually built within the aesthetic experience of those images, of photographs, is also a whole understanding of its kind of aural atmosphere. Aural, I mean AURAL, obviously. And why that interests me as a filmmaker is to think about them, and this gets back to echo, and it gets back to stratigraphy and archaeology. Because if I'm looking at a visual image in my film, because I have to understand that cinema is an art form that's spatio-temporal and sonic, right? And visual. When I'm looking at an image in cinema, I'm constantly thinking as a filmmaker of how the sound works as a sort of atmosphere that contains the frame, that creates a different form of montage that's not based upon one image after the other, but the montage is in that frame, in that instance, because sound gives it this extra layer that we wouldn't necessarily have if it was just purely visual. And so Moten talks about that in relationship to photography, where he uses more the kind of imaginative speculation, where you will look at an image and he wants to hear the scream coming like out of that image, you know? With something like cinema, we can quite literally do it because we can bring those two things together.
But it's interesting, right, that evidence is, you know, the photographic, the visual is linked to evidence in this kind of positivistic sense, and this oculocentric sense. And of course, evidence is the stuff of criminality, of what's the word, persecution. You know, it's the evidence that is looked for, cause, effect. The sort of evidence is what gives motive, and gives a kind of well, it produces narrative. And so, you know, there's this kind of interesting sense in which you perhaps are also seeking evidence which falls outside of the visual, but that you're, I mean, you talk about this in your essay that I've read, which is fantastic. You talk about this idea of listening to pictures, listening to archives, but also this listening extends beyond that. You know, it's the ethical act that's bound up with collaboration, of listening to. Could you say something about collaboration in terms of this film specifically?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And just as a way in, and just to respond to the earlier part of what you're saying, also, and I mean it's in the essay, so you know this, but I'll say it for the public. But that also this thing about oculocentrism. So the privileging of sight over sound, or the privileging of a sight over perhaps the oral or the voice. And I talk about how, so for example, in the 1980s, or the 1970s even, the introduction of the stop and search laws, that the police had the right to stop and interrogate people based on what they call reasonable suspicion. And then these people could be charged for certain crimes based upon what the policeman had, seen and witnessed in terms of their understanding on a visual level of what they perceived to be someone who would perhaps commit a crime or had committed a crime, and how that was taken into consideration more than the oral testimonies of the people that had been accused. So
Profiling.
Exactly. And then what interests me particularly about Hands with Songs, the Black Audio Film Collective film, is they interject in that space in the 1980s, and they say, we're not going to just go and look at the community and make further images and forms of sort of identitarian profiling based on the images of a community. They're going to listen to that community and the stories and the songs they're singing as a community, and they're going to try and unpick through history and try and understand why these events are happening in that particular moment. So Hands with Songs is a film made by a collective, but it's a very collaborative film in the sense that they work very closely with the communities in question. And I said that film, Hands with Songs, is an extraordinarily generous film in the sense that they are constantly trying to listen to a community. It's a type of cinema that listens to a community rather than takes or extracts knowledge from them on visual terms. So in relationship with this film we've just seen, Evidence of Things Unseen But Heard, the reason why I don't show it very much, and I feel I'm going to do something I'll probably regret later, but I always often have a habit of doing this. I think the film has great failings in the sense that I was very interested to try and go about that same process of collaboration. So I actually spent quite a lot of time in St. Paul's, and I was meeting with community members and activists from the community in St. Paul's that are still working to this day precisely around questions of to do with renaming monuments, not renaming, but also renaming streets, but also supplying extra information for the statue of Edward Colston that we see in the beginning. And I'd been hanging out at the Malcolm X Community Centre, which is in St. Paul's, and you spend time and you meet people, and then you suddenly run out of time and other things happen, and I got caught up making a feature film in Haiti, and I wasn't able to put in the right amount of time and work that I had originally intended, hence why I said it's the first in a series of collages which since have never actually been completed. So this I'd say is my sort of least collaborative film in quite a long stretch of collaborations, and in that sense I took on very much the role of a sort of kind of a researcher who's positioned very much on the outside,
right, as a voyeur potentially.
But that's the interesting thing, that then it becomes based on this sort of visualistic this visual aspect of looking into someone or some people or some place, and then trying to draw something together based upon that. I mean, nonetheless, I would say that the essay that I wrote that's published in the book, I think even though there's no direct quotation from people in there, there's quite a lot of, I think the way in which the essay was informed anyway has come from quite a lot of conversation and also a lot of reading, obviously. But I mean, the thing is, it's quite complicated because then there's also this thing of, if you go into a community that you're not part of, and you just take the position of interviewing and listening, there's also the possibility that you come across as somewhat sort of journalistic or kind of anthropological. And
well, let's not mince words. I mean, as a white Caucasian male looking in, I mean, there's a question here about identity and about whether, I guess, this is your history to tell.
yes, yeah,
Which is a very complicated question, particularly because I guess there is a sense in which this sound comes from a mixed community. But I wonder if, is this something that you're thinking about as a filmmaker, specifically in relation to this film?
yeah. I mean, that's a funny thing, is that actually, so before making this film, the last time I'd made a film in England was 2010, which was A Walk with Nigel. Oh, I made a film as well called Capital that I only showed once. And then since then I made films that were all about actually me being placed within cultures and countries that were not my own, and trying to figure out, and I think that actually since around 2012, I've been engaged in a very clear process of a sort of structured analysis of like what it means to be trying to make cinema, in a country or a culture that's not your own. So I made I made 2 films in Egypt, I made 2 films in Ghana, and then I made a film in the Dominican Republic, film in Portugal, and now a film in Haiti. And each time, each of those films was like a new step towards trying to understand how to make work somewhere like that. And when I made the film in Bristol, the weird thing is that because for me it was a return to England, I felt somehow that it was sort of easier for me just to step into that arena because I come from the same country, and because in many respects I come from the same no, not the same. I come from the same material, the same web of interactions that has constructed, what we might call as British identity, as people, that I was talking to and speaking with in Bristol in that time, who then don't appear in the film. In the sense that we had not similar experiences, because also there is a difference as well if you're talking about someone being Black British from, whose parents are from Jamaica, or a white British person whose parents are from different parts of England. It's a very different experience of growing up in the UK, of course. But somehow I felt that there was some conversation to be had of a sort of mutual understanding of, also I was interested in trying to figure out what what it even means to have a British identity, or what constitutes Britishness. And this is part of the conversation that I'm engaging in at the moment with Kojo Eshin around the film Hands with Songs, is trying to think about that, precisely those kind of questions. And I mean, I would just say that with this film, I think, again, one of its, probably the way in which it falls short of going into any kind of depth is precisely around those questions. And
I guess my reading of this also is that, if you think about the archival film of the Sus video, which presumably is like a training video for police or something, of the cop
who stops those 2 young men.
Yeah, there is a sense in which he figures himself as being outside of race. He is the neutral.
Yeah.
He doesn't understand himself as being coloured because he is the neutral. And I guess there's a way of understanding, this idea of an afterlife of colonialism, particularly in Britain, is that it's everyone's problem. Or perhaps it seems to be more some people's problems than others, but it's, everybody has a kind of part to play in acknowledging the afterlives of kind of colonial legacies. Sorry.
No, go on, finish that. Well,
no, and then if we just think about the figure of the Colston statue.
Mm.
I mean, you talk about this idea that Bristol exists as a city because of the extent of Colston's activities in plantations and slave trading. Blood seeps from every brick. Blood seeps from the concrete, and that history never settles or is in the past. It's something that continues to be renegotiated in the present, which is why the Colston statue at the beginning, it's one of many kind of conversations around statues and monuments around that time, Cecil Rhodes being the most obvious one, but it demonstrates this way in which these histories never settle.
No, for sure. And actually that thing about these histories never settling is very interesting, because it's this that's also something I've written about elsewhere, to do with this idea of, or this understanding of an echo, and an echo as being or maybe we can talk about it in different ways, thinking about what it means to return to a point of entanglement, and which is, this is a bit long-winded, but there's a concept in the work of Edouard Glissant which he calls a détour, which in French makes sense. It's a return to a point, but at kind of one remove. So it's not a circle. It's a return to. It's not a revolution. It's more like a turning of this part of a spiral. So you come back round to an event, but at a slight remove. And in Glissant's work, that spiral keeps on coming back to a point of entanglement, of a sort of a problematic entanglement that refuses to be repressed because of trauma and because of a certain struggle. And I think that if we're looking at the history, or if we're looking at the afterlife of slavery in the United Kingdom, I would go so far as to argue that I exist as a British person because of an afterlife, or of the pre-existence of the British slave trade. So it's not just Bristolians and Liverpudlians and Londoners, and and that's the work of this fantastic group of researchers at the University College London. They have this research group called Legacies of British Slave Ownership, in which they've been researching into which people in the 19th century, after the abolition of slavery, made claims of compensation for loss of business from the government. The government paid £20 million in, I can't remember when exactly, 1833, something like that, after the abolition of slavery. And people made claims for compensation. And these researchers in UCL looked into the archives of those court cases, and they've made a digital map online where you can go through a map of Great Britain and you can look at which houses made claims for how much money, and you start to understand. So I'm from Norfolk, right? I'm from Norwich, and up near where my parents now live, in Burnham Thorpe, there's Holcombe Hall, and Holcombe Hall was set up by a British aristocrat called Thomas Cook. He built it in the 18th century. His money comes from wool, right? He was rich from wool. So you would think that he's not caught up in the wealth of Atlantic slavery. But in fact, you look in the archive, and it turns out that he made a claim because he had been putting his riches from wool into investing into slave plantations in Barbados. So, and then his family that live today, I'm sorry if any of them are watching because they might get angry, but, it's a question of inheritance and debt and reparations. And I'm not saying that I do this kind of work because I feel that I've got some sense of guilt that needs to be reckoned with. But I think that in terms of me trying to figure out and understand what my position is in relationship to the echoes of these points of entanglement that refuse to be repressed, that, I'd say it's politically, it's vital that I would try and delve into that kind of work. And I just finished just one thing that actually, anyway, with my recent work now, So that's 2018, or the research was 2017, so it's 3 years ago. And then thinking a lot about that since then. And actually the work I'm interested in doing at the moment is precisely more a look at that and how the money from those processes of plantation capitalism, and from the compensation and from the wealth that was accrued, went into industry and went into infrastructure in Great Britain, and how we have actually all grown up within a web, of, within infrastructure and institutions that have been built off the basis of the economic gain, off the bodies and exploitation of people that were deemed worthy of being, used in that sense. And
I was really interested to see, or to read the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at Oxford. The college, Oriel College at Oxford, said that it would lose an estimated 100 million in gifts if the Cecil Rhodes statue was removed.
wow.
If we think about racial capitalism as this thing that's ongoing, 100 million, because those people are invested in the idea of roads remaining. And those investments obviously complex. Louis, I'm just going to open this up to see if there are any questions from the chat. There was one earlier on that Mark Ariel Waller put in straight away. I think we may have answered it, but he said, where did you research the images, Louis?
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, yeah, so the research is from the Bristol City Archives, and then also from YouTube. But the YouTube stuff is just the moving images of it's actually from a BBC documentary that was made in the 1980s about St. Paul's after the uprising, and then just YouTube videos with Josh Acker, Mad Professor, people like that. And otherwise, yeah, all of the archival material, the newspapers and the photographs, all came from the Bristol City Archives. And actually, this time I got official permission to use them, which I think is the first time in my life.
And so the YouTube stuff, just like, this is a kind of banal question, but like the YouTube stuff, do you just kind of take as you wish, like sampling, and then deal with it later, or how do you clear that?
The YouTube stuff, I use short sections, which then at the end of the video, I always cite the source. So this is why I like this idea of thinking about it as an essay, in the sense that, you sort of at least reference your sources and you cite where the material's coming from. So in that sense, it's not that different from writing an essay. And you might, often when I wrote essays before, I would used to cite enormous passages from people. And, but with the archive material, for some reason, it feels like, and that's another question I've been fascinated in for years, which is like archives as the kind of custodians of history, and how we can intervene within that space as a way to undermine their power. Somehow YouTube, because it's so easy to rip videos off it, you don't feel that it has such a powerful thing. But this is kind of terrible in the sense that actually it's the people whose original work you're ripping off. You're not ripping off YouTube, you're kind of ripping them off as such, which is problematic. Hence why I always, in the last 4 years of making work, have been always citing where those materials came from, what the original sources are. So I just list every single YouTube link so you can see, who made them and where they came from.
One last question. So the film was made for an exhibition, as we've learned. What's it like streaming it on YouTube? Is streaming something that you've done before? Are there ideal conditions in which your films should be seen?
I mean, the streaming thing is a bit weird, because to be actually honestly, doing this talk is weird, because it's a very strange way to speak, isn't it? Because there's something about, also because I can see myself, right, while I'm talking. So it's this kind of constant performance. Like I'm really aware of the fact that I'm performing all of this talk to you, and that if we were just in a pub, I would be talking in a pretty different way. So I find that a bit strange and a bit like disconcerting and weird. But it's the same even with teaching. I was teaching the other day, like I said, and whilst teaching, and I was delivering it like a lecture. You know, like I read a paper, and you feel so performative. It's strange,
Yeah.
even more than, you know, just inner students with a room. But in terms of the film, anyway, yeah, I don't know. I'm not that happy with streaming films, but actually with this one, it felt pretty good because also I'm quite keen on the sort of lo-fi aspect of it. I mean, I don't shoot in 4K and things like that anyway, or 35 mil. You know, this is like really low quality downloaded videos from YouTube and then relatively okay scans. So actually, in terms of the image and stuff, it's quite interesting. Plus, I think we had about 60 viewers, so that was quite nice. But ideally, I'm really, you know, obsessed with the cinema. I live in Berlin at the moment, and I used to go to the cinema about 4 times a week, maybe sometimes 7 times. I would go every day, the Arsenal, and like watch films. So I go like a lot. And for me, the films that I make really, like, in terms of the way you experience the sound and the picture, it's always made for that kind of experience. I love this huge image and this engulfing soundtrack. It's like, you know, if you know, I know you're a music fan and a DJ, and sitting at home and listening to your records is not the same as hearing it
In a club.
on the sound system at
Yeah,
Berghain.
yeah.
You know, like Berghein's going to be closed forever now. I don't know when we're going to go again. Or I don't mean me and you, I mean me and general public.
Yeah.
And it's you know, it's that experience of the nightclub as a very specific social setting, an experience of a type of behavior, even if the nightclub and the cinema have been completely ripped off and capitalized upon till they've changed. But you know, imagine like an illegal rave compared to Berghain. It has nothing to do with it. But nonetheless, these are the sort of contained and closed spaces that are being forever closed and contained. And for me, it's a great worry because I'm very excited in those types of behavior that happen in those specific forms of sociality.
Communitarian sort of assembly.
But also what Saidiya Hartman would call the wayward. You know, she's written this new book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, by Saidiya Hartman's fantastic book. And she talks about, I mean, it's very specific what she's talking about. She's talking about the experience of life of African Americans after the abolition of slavery in the United States of America. And she talks about wayward behavior and how it was constantly policed and this permanent process of dispossession, of slowly enclosing through surveillance, police control. And I think that, you know, spaces like nightclubs and, you know, and I think the cinema, in the way that it allows for a type of, you know, social and collective dreaming. There's this thing actually that I think I think Jean-Luc Godard said it, and it's like him riffing off Mallarmé. So Mallarmé, the famous French poet, Stéphane Mallarmé, he said, alone we are together, or separated we are together. Séparés, on est ensemble. And Godard said this, he said, in the cinema, together we are alone. But at home with TV, alone we are together.
Yeah, right.
You know, and it's very strange. So what we've done here tonight is really it's the reversal of what I love about film, but it's the only thing we can do right now. And to be honest, just to have a conversation with you has cheered me up enormously.
Well, look, Louis, thank you so much for letting us show the film, and also thank you for your time for joining us this evening and having this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much for the
and
question.
Also thank you for the Assembly House Trust for hosting us, and also for the attention of those of you at home.
Yeah,
in isolation. Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I'm back on screen.
So to YouTube.
My Zoom call's still going.
That's good.
There we go. Okay. So thank you everyone, and thank you to Louis Henderson and Jonathan P. Watts for screening and that interesting discussion on researching and archives, the process of dub, and the experience of cinema, which we're all currently missing. Following on from the discussions that we just had on collaboration, the next event, again it'll be once every 2 weeks from now, will be on the 28th of May. We'll focus on the Circle of Perpetual Choirs, which is a choreographed piece by Tyra Silverthorne, created in collaboration with 11 Farah House, which is a group of 4 artists. It's a piece accompanied by original music by Sarah Westwood. We'll be screening a recording of parts of the performance from when it was performed at Siobhan Davies' dance studio, and the video will be divided into several sections, and we'll be joined by those involved in the project to discuss and contextualise the performance. So that's on May the 28th, in 2 weeks' time, on Thursday night at 7:30. And do join the mailing list if you're not already. In the other projects on tonight, actually starting in 3 minutes, is Transmissions, which is a online video platform set up by a few artists 4 weeks ago. Yes, it's now in its 4th week. I'll post a link in the chat for anyone who wants to watch that, and it'll also be broadcast again at 9 AM tomorrow morning. This is all on, the transmissions are on Twitch. I think that's everything from here. So I look forward to seeing you on the 28th. Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone at home. Look after yourselves, and stay alert and stay happy. Thank you to everyone saying thank you in the chat. Chloe, Jasmina, William, Ella, and Louise there too. Thanks again.